There is a particular kind of silence that fills a room when your wife humiliates you in front of 50 strangers. And I can tell you from personal experience that it sounds exactly like the moment before a grenade goes off. That split second where the pin has been pulled and everything in the universe seems to hold its breath, waiting for the explosion that everyone knows is coming, but nobody can stop. I was standing in the middle of the Hartwell Gallery in downtown Atlanta, surrounded by people who probably spent more on their shoes than I made in a week, holding a glass of champagne that cost more than my first car, and watching my wife Miranda laugh at something another man had just whispered in her ear while his hand rested on the small of her back, like he owned every inch of her. The gallery smelled like expensive perfume, pretension, and the kind of desperation that only truly insecure people can generate when they're trying to prove to everyone around them that they belong somewhere they secretly know they don't. My name is Daniel Wright, and at 38 years old, I had already survived 3 combat tours in Afghanistan, a helicopter crash that should have killed me, 17 different shrapnel wounds that had left a roadmap of scars across my torso, and the kind of loneliness that settles into your bones when you realize that the woman you married sees you as nothing more than a convenient placeholder until something better comes along. I had been awarded a Bronze Star for pulling 3 wounded Marines out of a burning vehicle while under enemy fire, had been promoted twice for leadership under circumstances that would have broken most men, and had earned the respect of every soldier I had ever served with through a combination of competence, courage, and an unwillingness to ask anyone to do something I wouldn't do myself. I was wearing my best suit that night, a navy blue number that Miranda had approved with a dismissive nod 3 years ago. And even though I had made sure every thread was pressed and every button polished, I still felt like an imposter among all those gallery patrons with their designer labels and practiced smiles. The art on the walls was abstract garbage that looked like someone had let a toddler loose with a paint bucket, but everyone was nodding sagely at each piece, like they could actually see something profound in the random splatters. And I wondered how many of them were just pretending because they were too afraid to admit they had no idea what they were looking at. Miranda was holding court near a particularly ugly piece called Emergence of the Corporate Soul, which was basically a gray canvas with a single red dot in the corner, and she was surrounded by her colleagues from the investment firm where she worked. All of them dressed like they had stepped out of a catalog for people with more money than taste. The man with his hand on her back was Vince Coldwell, a 40-year-old shark in an Italian suit who had been circling Miranda for months, always showing up at the right parties, always saying the right things, always looking at her like she was a stock he was planning to acquire. I had watched their little dance for weeks, telling myself that Miranda was just being polite, just networking, just doing what she needed to do to get ahead in the cutthroat world of Atlanta finance. But there was something about the way she leaned into his touch tonight that made my stomach turn with a certainty I had been trying to avoid for far too long. The people around them were laughing at something Vince had said, their heads thrown back in that exaggerated way that rich people use to signal appreciation when they're more interested in impressing each other than actually finding anything funny. I recognized several of them from previous events Miranda had dragged me to. There was Harrison Blake, a hedge fund manager whose trophy wife had left him for her personal trainer just last month. Patricia Wellsworth, a corporate lawyer whose reputation for ruthlessness extended to her personal relationships as well as her professional ones. And Tyler Morrison, a venture capitalist who had made his fortune by funding companies that made people's lives slightly worse in exchange for marginal efficiency improvements. These were Miranda's people now, the tribe she had chosen over me, and watching them all together made me realize just how far apart we had grown during the 7 years of our marriage. I approached the group because that's what a husband does, because I had driven 45 minutes through traffic to be at this event that Miranda had insisted was crucial for her career, because somewhere deep down I still believed that the woman I married 7 years ago was hiding somewhere inside this polished stranger who looked at me like I was an inconvenience she couldn't quite figure out how to dispose of. My hands were calloused from years of working with heavy machinery at the port, and I noticed how soft and manicured everyone else's hands looked as I made my way through the crowd, feeling their eyes slide over me with that particular blend of curiosity and dismissal that rich people reserve for those they consider beneath them. The floor was polished marble that reflected the crystal chandeliers overhead, and my worn dress shoes squeaked slightly with each step, announcing my approach like an unwanted trumpet fanfare. "Miranda," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the tightness in my chest. "I was thinking we could head home soon, maybe grab some dinner on the way. That Thai place you used to like over on Peachtree." The conversation around her stopped like someone had hit a pause button, and I watched as Miranda's face transformed from animated laughter to something cold and sharp, the kind of expression I had seen on officers who were about to deliver particularly unpleasant orders. Vince's hand didn't move from her back, and he looked at me with a smile that reminded me of a wolf eyeing a particularly slow rabbit, all teeth and no warmth whatsoever. The other members of their little circle suddenly became very interested in their champagne glasses, their eyes darting between us like spectators at a tennis match who could sense something explosive was about to happen. "Daniel," Miranda said, and the way she pronounced my name made it sound like a disease she was describing to a doctor. "I'm in the middle of something important here. Can you please just wait somewhere until I'm ready to leave?" "We've been here for 3 hours," I said, trying to keep my tone reasonable, even as I felt the familiar heat of anger starting to build behind my eyes. "And you haven't spoken to me once since we walked through the door. I'm just saying maybe we could spend some time together, that's all." What happened next is burned into my memory with the kind of clarity that usually only comes with trauma. The moment replaying in my mind like a film loop that I can't switch off no matter how hard I try. Miranda turned to face me fully, and I watched her lips curl into a smile that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with cruelty. The kind of smile that cats give to mice right before the final pounce. The music from the string quartet in the corner seemed to fade away, and I was suddenly aware of how many people were watching us, their conversations trailing off as they sensed the impending spectacle. "You want to know the problem, Daniel?" Miranda said, her voice rising just enough to ensure everyone nearby could hear every word. "The problem is that you follow me around like a lost puppy, begging for attention, begging for scraps of my time like you're some kind of charity case that I'm obligated to deal with. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is to have you trailing after me at these events, standing there in your cheap suit with your calloused hands, making me look like I'm married beneath myself?" A woman behind me gasped audibly, and I heard someone mutter something that sounded like "oh my God" under their breath. The string quartet had stopped playing, or maybe they hadn't, but either way, all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears and the steady beat of my own heart, surprisingly calm despite the circumstances. I noticed that Vince had pulled out his phone and was holding it in a way that suggested he might be recording the encounter, probably to share with his friends later as an amusing anecdote about the time his girlfriend's husband made a fool of himself at a gallery opening. I felt the words hit me like physical blows, each one landing with precision in the exact spots where I was most vulnerable. In the insecurities I had confided to her during late nights when I thought we were building something real, in the fears I had shared because I trusted her to hold them gently. She knew about the nightmares that still woke me up at 3 a.m, about the survivors, guilt that made me wonder why I had come home when so many of my brothers had not, about the imposter syndrome that plagued me every time I tried to fit into her world of suits and cocktail parties. And now she was using all of that intimate knowledge as a weapon, wielding it in front of an audience of strangers who would remember this moment for years to come. Vince was still smiling that predator smile, and I could see him enjoying every moment of my humiliation, drinking it in like it was the finest wine the gallery had to offer. "Miranda, please," I started, but she wasn't finished, not even close to finished. "From now on," she declared, her voice carrying across the gallery like a proclamation from a queen to a peasant, "I'll decide when we talk or spend time together. Do you understand me? Stop chasing me around like some desperate hound. Stop calling me 15 times a day to ask about my schedule. Stop showing up at my work to bring me lunch like we're some kind of adorable couple in a romantic comedy. Know your place, Daniel. Know your place." The silence that followed was absolute, a void so complete that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears and the distant sound of traffic outside on the street. Every eye in our section of the gallery was fixed on me, waiting to see how I would react, waiting for the explosion that my military background surely promised, waiting for the drama that would give them something to talk about at their next cocktail party. Vince had the audacity to chuckle, a soft sound that might as well have been a slap across my face, and I saw him squeeze Miranda's waist in a gesture of possession that was meant entirely for my benefit. Here's the thing about being a Marine. They train you to react to threats with overwhelming force, to meet aggression with controlled violence, to eliminate anything that poses a danger to you or your squad. But they also teach you discipline, the kind of iron-willed self-control that allows a man to sit perfectly still while bullets crack past his head, to wait for the perfect shot rather than wasting ammunition on panic fire. I felt all of that training kick in as I stood there processing Miranda's words, felt my breathing slow and my heart rate drop as my body prepared itself for whatever was coming next. But I wasn't going to give these people the show they wanted, wasn't going to confirm every prejudice they had about blue-collar workers being unable to control their emotions, wasn't going to hand Miranda the ammunition she needed to paint herself as a victim. Instead, I felt something shift inside me, a fundamental realignment of my understanding of who I was and who she was and what we had become. The love I had been clinging to, the hope that things could somehow go back to the way they were when we first got married. All of it evaporated in that moment like morning fog burned away by an unforgiving sun. I set my champagne glass on the nearest table with a gentleness that seemed to surprise everyone watching, and I straightened my shoulders the way my drill instructor had taught me back at Paris Island. When I spoke, my voice was calm and steady, the voice of a man who had just made a decision and was now simply implementing it with military precision. "You're right, Miranda," I said, meeting her eyes with a steadiness that I could see unnerved her. "I've been chasing you, trying to hold on to something that clearly doesn't exist anymore. But here's the thing about chasing. At some point, a man has to decide whether what he's chasing is worth catching. And I've just decided that you're not." I turned on my heel with the precision of a parade ground pivot and walked toward the exit, my back straight and my head high. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea, and I could hear the whispers starting up behind me, the buzz of gossip that would spread through Atlanta's social circles like wildfire by morning. Miranda called something after me, her voice suddenly sounding less certain than it had a moment ago. But I didn't turn around, didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing any emotion on my face. The night air hit me like a blessing when I stepped outside, cool and clean after the suffocating atmosphere of the gallery. My truck was parked 3 blocks away because the valet had looked at my 10-year-old Ford F-150 like it might contaminate the Maseratis and Bentleys in the front row. And I walked those 3 blocks in a daze that was half shock and half liberation. By the time I reached my truck and climbed into the familiar embrace of its worn leather seat, I had already started planning, my mind clicking through options and possibilities with the tactical clarity that had kept me alive through more firefights than I cared to count. The drive back to the house Miranda and I shared in Buckhead took 40 minutes in the light evening traffic, and I spent every one of those minutes thinking about what I needed to do next. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway, a 3-story monument to Miranda's ambitions that we couldn't really afford, but that she had insisted was necessary for her career, for the image she needed to project, for the kind of life she deserved to live. I had worked double shifts at the port for 2 years to help make the down payment, had sacrificed vacations and hobbies and any sense of personal fulfillment to ensure that Miranda had everything she wanted. And what had it gotten me? A public humiliation in front of people I would never see again, and a wife who apparently viewed me as an embarrassment to be managed rather than a partner to be loved. I didn't sleep that night, but I wasn't awake in the way that suggests distress or anxiety. Instead, I moved through the house with purpose, gathering documents and making lists and preparing for the legal battle I knew was coming. The Marine Corps had taught me that proper preparation prevents poor performance, and I was determined to execute this withdrawal with the same precision I had brought to every mission I'd ever been assigned. By 3 a.m, I had located our marriage certificate, our prenuptial agreement that Miranda had insisted on, but that I had actually read carefully before signing, financial records for the past 5 years, and documentation of every major purchase we had made together. The house was quiet in a way that felt almost oppressive, The kind of silence that only exists in places where people have stopped really living together and started merely coexisting. I walked through rooms that Miranda had decorated without consulting me, past furniture she had chosen because it photographed well for her social media accounts, under light fixtures that cost more than my first truck had. Every object in this house was a reminder of how little my preferences had ever mattered in our marriage, how completely I had allowed myself to be erased in the name of keeping the peace. In the kitchen, I made myself a pot of strong coffee and sat at the marble island that Miranda had imported from Italy at a cost that still made me wince when I thought about it. The granite was cold under my hands, and I remembered all the times I had sat in this exact spot, waiting for Miranda to come home from work, hoping that tonight would be different, that tonight she would look at me the way she used to during our courtship, before she had decided that I was a project that needed improvement rather than a partner who deserved appreciation. By 5 in the morning, I had packed 2 duffel bags with everything I actually cared about, which turned out to be surprisingly little. Some clothes, my military decorations and discharge papers, a toolbox that had belonged to my father, or at least the man I had always believed was my father, and a few photographs from before Miranda had decided that my Marine Corps service wasn't something to be proud of, but rather something to be hidden from her sophisticated friends. I held one of those photographs for a long moment, a picture of me in full dress uniform on the day I received my Bronze Star, my face younger and my eyes holding a brightness that had slowly dimmed over the years of trying to be someone I wasn't. I packed it carefully, making sure it wouldn't get damaged during the move. I left behind the expensive watch she had given me for our 5th anniversary, the designer clothes she had insisted I buy to fit in with her crowd, and every other piece of evidence that I had spent 7 years trying to become someone I wasn't. Those things had never really belonged to me anyway. They were costumes I had worn to play a role that Miranda had written for me, and now that the play was over, I had no more need for the wardrobe. The wedding ring came off last, and I set it on the glass coffee table in the living room, with a sound that seemed to echo through the empty house like a gunshot. Beside it, I placed the divorce papers I had, downloaded and filled out during the night, already signed in all the places that required my signature. I didn't write a long letter explaining my feelings, didn't pour out my heart in some desperate attempt to make her understand what she had done. Instead, I left a single sticky note on the bathroom mirror, where I knew she would see it when she finally came home. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. Don't look for me. The sun was just starting to come up over the Atlanta skyline when I walked out of that house for the last time. And I remember thinking that sunrises after a night of no sleep have a particular quality of beauty, like the universe is rewarding you for making it through the darkness. My truck started on the first try despite its age, and I pointed it south towards Savannah, where I had kept a small workshop for the past few years, a place where I repaired heavy machinery for the Port Authority and escaped from Miranda's constant criticism whenever she decided she needed space from my oppressive presence. The drive to Savannah usually took about 4 hours, but I stopped twice along the way, once for coffee and once to sit by the side of the road and let the reality of what I was doing wash over me in waves of grief and anger and something that felt almost like relief. I had spent 7 years of my life trying to be enough for a woman who had never really wanted me in the first place, who had married me because I was stable and reliable and conveniently available when she decided she needed a husband to advance her career, who had systematically stripped away every piece of my identity until I barely recognized myself in the mirror. When I finally pulled up to my workshop on the outskirts of Savannah's industrial port district, the building looked better than it had any right to look. A converted warehouse that I had purchased for next to nothing 5 years ago and slowly transformed into something functional. The smell hit me as soon as I opened the door. Grease and metal and the salt tang of the nearby ocean, the honest aromas of hard work and practical purpose. This was where I felt most like myself, surrounded by engines and hydraulic systems and the mechanical challenges that I understood far better than I had ever understood my wife. The back corner of the warehouse contained a small living space that I had set up for nights when I worked late, a cot and a hot plate and a tiny bathroom with a shower that only produced lukewarm water on good days. It wasn't much, but it was mine, completely and entirely mine, in a way that the Buckhead house had never been. And as I set my duffel bags down on the concrete floor, I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in years. The next few weeks blurred together in a haze of physical labor and emotional recovery that I couldn't have separated even if I'd wanted to. I threw myself into work with the intensity that surprised even me, taking on repair jobs that other mechanics had declared impossible, pushing my body to exhaustion every day so that I would be too tired at night to lie awake thinking about Miranda and Vince and all the ways I had failed to be the man she wanted me to be. The Port Authority started sending more work my way as word spread that Daniel Wright could fix anything, that he didn't quit until the job was done, that his prices were fair and his craftsmanship was impeccable. There was a particular satisfaction in fixing broken things, in taking something that the world had given up on and making it work again. Every engine I repaired, every hydraulic system I restored, every piece of machinery I brought back from the dead felt like a small victory against the forces of entropy and decay that seemed to govern so much of human existence. I understood machines in a way I had never understood people, could diagnose their problems by the sound they made, could feel their pain in the vibrations of their components, could sense when something was about to fail before it actually did. If only relationships came with diagnostic codes and service manuals, maybe I wouldn't have made so many mistakes with Miranda. The other mechanics at the port started calling me the miracle worker as a joke, but there was real respect underneath the humor. Old Jack Patterson, who had been working on ships and cranes for 40 years, told me one day that he hadn't seen talent like mine since his own mentor had retired back in the 80s. Marcus Williams, a young guy who reminded me of myself at that age, started hanging around my bay after hours, asking questions about techniques and approaches that they didn't teach in any vocational school. I found myself becoming a teacher without really meaning to, passing on knowledge that I had accumulated through years of trial and error and the kind of learning that only comes from getting your hands dirty. I started studying in what little free time I had, poring over engineering manuals and technical documents about hydraulic systems and automated machinery, filling the hours that I used to spend trying to please Miranda with knowledge that would actually serve me well. The local community college offered night classes in mechanical engineering, and I enrolled in as many as my schedule would allow, sitting in classrooms full of kids half my age and soaking up information like a sponge that had been dry for too long. My professors quickly learned that I wasn't there to check a box or fulfill a requirement, that I actually wanted to understand the principles behind the procedures, and they started spending extra time with me after class, introducing me to concepts that weren't covered in the standard curriculum. My hands were always covered in grease and my back ached constantly from the physical demands of the work. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was building something that mattered instead of just maintaining an illusion. The cot in the back of the workshop became my home, a Spartan existence that would have horrified Miranda, but that suited me perfectly. I ate simple meals, kept my space clean and organized, and slowly began to remember who I was before I had tried to become someone else for the benefit of a woman who had never appreciated the effort. Miranda called 3 times in that first week, and I let every call go to voicemail without listening to the messages. Her texts ranged from angry to apologetic to threatening, a whiplash of emotional manipulation that might have worked on me a month ago, but now just seemed pathetic. She showed up at the workshop once, pounding on the door and demanding to be let in, but I had already installed new locks and a security system that my military contacts had helped me set up, and eventually she gave up and drove away in her leased Mercedes. The divorce papers came back signed 10 days after I had left them on the coffee table, and I felt nothing but relief when I saw her signature next to mine. The thing about hitting rock bottom is that once you're there, the only direction left to go is up, and I started climbing with a determination that surprised even me. I began modernizing the workshop, investing the small amount of savings I had managed to hide from Miranda over the years into new equipment and better tools. I hired a helper, a kid named Tommy from the wrong side of Savannah, who had grown up fixing cars in his father's garage, and who had the same hungry look in his eyes that I remembered seeing in my own mirror at his age. Together, we started taking on bigger contracts, more complex repairs, jobs that required creativity and innovation, rather than just brute force mechanical knowledge. 3 months after I left Miranda, I was driving back from a parts supplier near Charleston when the hurricane hit with almost no warning. The Weather Service had predicted the storm would turn northeast and miss the coast, but hurricanes have their own ideas about where they want to go. And this one decided it wanted to introduce itself personally to anyone foolish enough to be on the roads that night. The rain came down so hard that my wipers couldn't keep up, even on their highest setting, and the wind rocked my truck on its suspension like a ship in heavy seas. I should have pulled over and waited it out, should have found shelter under an overpass or in a parking garage, but I had learned stubbornness in the Marine Corps, and it wasn't a lesson I could easily unlearn. The highway was nearly deserted, sensible people having heeded the warnings that I had apparently decided didn't apply to me. My headlights barely penetrated the wall of rain ahead, and I was gripping the steering wheel so hard that my knuckles had turned white. The radio had stopped working about 10 miles back, cutting off mid-sentence during a weather update that was probably advising listeners to stay indoors. Lightning cracked across the sky in jagged patterns that seemed to last for seconds instead of the instant they should have occupied, and the thunder that followed was so loud it made my chest vibrate. The sedan appeared in my headlights without warning, a flash of silver metal spinning across the flooded road surface like a hockey puck on ice. I watched it happen in slow motion, the way traumatic events always seem to unfold. The elegant vehicle losing its battle with physics and sliding through the guardrail at the edge of a steep embankment like it was made of paper rather than German-engineered steel. The car tumbled down into the darkness, flipping at least twice that I could see before it disappeared into the ravine below. And even over the sound of the storm, I could hear the crunch of metal and the shattering of glass as it came to rest somewhere in the chaos of broken trees and rain-soaked mud. I pulled over without thinking, my body already moving before my brain had fully processed what I had just witnessed. Every instinct from my military training kicked in simultaneously, the same surge of focused calm that had carried me through firefights and ambushes and every other deadly situation the Marines had thrown at me. The rain was coming down so hard that I was soaked through within seconds of leaving the truck, and the wind nearly knocked me off my feet as I made my way toward the broken guardrail, but I barely noticed any of it. All that mattered was the person or persons in that car, the lives that might be saved if I moved fast enough and made the right decisions. The embankment was steep and slippery with mud, and I half climbed and half slid my way down to where the sedan had come to rest against a cluster of pine trees. Its front end crumpled like an accordion, and its headlights still somehow functioning, casting eerie beams through the rain and mist. The smell of gasoline was strong enough to make my eyes water, mixing with the scent of wet earth and broken vegetation to create an aroma that would stay with me for weeks afterwards. There was a woman inside. I could see her through the shattered driver's side window, unconscious and slumped against her seatbelt, with blood streaming from a cut on her forehead. She looked to be in her 60s, elegant even in her current state, with silver hair that was now matted with blood and expensive jewelry that glinted in the ambient light. The door was jammed shut, crushed by the impact, and I had to use all my strength to wrench it open, feeling the metal protest and finally give way with a screech that somehow carried over the storm. Getting her out of the car was like solving a puzzle designed by someone who wanted the puzzle to remain unsolved, navigating around deployed airbags and twisted metal while trying not to move her spine in case she had back injuries I couldn't see. The rain was making everything slippery, and twice I nearly dropped her as I maneuvered her free of the wreckage. But finally I had her in my arms and was carrying her up the embankment, with muscles screaming in protest and lungs burning from exertion. By the time the ambulance arrived, I had been performing CPR for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 15 minutes, and the paramedics had to physically pull me away from her so they could take over. One of them mentioned something about her heartbeat being weak but present, about how close she had come to not making it at all, about how my intervention had probably saved her life. I barely registered any of it, just sat in the rain by the side of the road and watched them load her into the ambulance and drive away with lights flashing and sirens wailing. At the hospital, the chaos was controlled but intense. Doctors and nurses moving with practiced efficiency as they worked to stabilize the woman I had pulled from the ravine. I sat in the waiting room in my soaking wet clothes, leaving puddles on the floor and receiving disapproving looks from the night staff that I was too exhausted to care about. The hours passed slowly, and at some point someone brought me a blanket and a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been made sometime during the previous administration but was warm and caffeinated and therefore acceptable. I didn't know why I stayed, couldn't have explained it if someone had asked, but something kept me in that uncomfortable plastic chair while the storm raged outside and the hospital bustled around me. Maybe it was the Marine Corps training that insisted you never leave a casualty behind. Maybe it was just basic human decency, or maybe it was something else entirely that I wouldn't understand until much later. The doctor who finally came to speak with me was a tired-looking man in his 50s with bloodshot eyes and a stethoscope around his neck that looked like it had been there so long it had become a part of his anatomy. He asked if I was family, and when I explained what had happened on the road, his expression shifted from professional neutrality to something approaching respect. "She's stable," he said, "but she lost a lot of blood, and she has a rare blood type that we're running low on. We've put out calls to the blood bank, but with the storm—" "What type?" I asked, not sure why it mattered. "AB negative," he said. "It's one of the rarest types. Less than 1% of the population has it." Something clicked in the back of my mind, a memory from my Marine Corps days when we had all been blood typed as part of our basic medical training. "That's my type," I heard myself saying. "AB negative. I can donate." The doctor looked at me like I had just performed a minor miracle, which I suppose from his perspective I had, and within minutes I was being led to a different room where a nurse was preparing to draw blood. The process was straightforward and not particularly comfortable, but I had endured worse during my time in the service, and I found myself drifting into a strange half-sleep while the bag slowly filled with what the woman on the operating table apparently needed to survive. It was during this procedure that things took a turn I never could have anticipated. The nurse, an older woman with kind eyes and hands that moved with the confidence of decades of experience, was making small talk to keep me alert, asking about the accident and the rescue and how I had ended up being both the Good Samaritan and the compatible blood donor in the same night. "It's almost like fate," she said with a smile that suggested she believed in such things. I was about to dismiss the comment with the standard response of a man who had seen too much random death and destruction to believe in fate. But then a doctor came in, not the same one from before, but a younger man with an urgent expression. "The patient is stable," he said, "but we need to run some additional tests on both your blood and hers. There's something unusual in the compatibility that our lab wants to verify." I didn't think much of it at the time, assumed it was some technical medical matter that would sort itself out without my involvement. But when the results came back the next morning, they turned my entire understanding of my life completely upside down. The woman I had rescued was named Sarah Wright, and according to the DNA analysis that the hospital had run as part of their standard verification protocols, she was my biological mother. Let me pause here to explain just how impossible this seemed at the time, how completely it contradicted everything I thought I knew about my own history. I had been raised by James and Mary Wright in a small town in rural Georgia, had grown up believing I was their biological son, had never had any reason to question the reality of my childhood. My father had died when I was 16, a heart attack while working on the farm that had been in his family for generations, and my mother had followed him 4 years later, worn down by grief and the relentless demands of trying to keep the farm going without him. The idea that I was not their biological child, that I had been kidnapped as an infant and raised by strangers, that my real mother was a wealthy woman who had been searching for me for 3 decades, all of it seemed like the plot of a soap opera rather than the reality of my life. But the DNA didn't lie, and as Sarah recovered from her injuries over the following days, the story of my true origins slowly came to light. I had been taken from a shopping cart outside a supermarket in Atlanta when I was 8 months old, snatched by a woman named Mary Wright, whose own infant son had died of SIDS just weeks before, and whose grief-shattered mind had convinced her that I was somehow meant to replace him. The police investigation at the time had gone nowhere. The kidnapper had disappeared into the rural anonymity of Georgia's farm country, and Sarah Wright had spent the next 30 years never giving up hope that her son would somehow find his way back to her. Sarah and I sat in her hospital room on the 3rd day after the accident, both of us still processing the incredible coincidence that had brought us together after 3 decades of separation. She was sitting up now, her head bandaged but her eyes clear and sharp with an intelligence that I could see was formidable even when diminished by trauma and medication. "I'm not going to pretend this isn't strange," I said, because I had never been good at sugarcoating things and saw no reason to start now. "I didn't save you because I was looking for a mother. I didn't even know you existed. I pulled you out of that car because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted anything in return." Sarah looked at me for a long moment, and I could see her assessing me with the same kind of tactical evaluation that I had learned in the Marine Corps, measuring my character and my intentions, and deciding whether I was worth investing her trust in. "I know," she said finally. "If you had known who I was, you would have done the same thing. I can see that in you. You have my husband's eyes. Did you know that? Richard died 12 years ago, but I still see him every time I look in the mirror. And now I see him in you." She told me about her life, about the logistics empire she had built after her husband's death, transforming a modest trucking company into a multi-state operation that moved goods from coast to coast. She told me about the private investigators she had hired over the years, the dead ends and false hopes, the gradual acceptance that she might never find her stolen child. And she told me about the grandson she had wanted to give Richard, the legacy she had wanted to continue, the emptiness that had never quite been filled despite all her professional success. "I can't give you back your childhood," she said, and I could hear the grief in her voice even after all these years. "I can't undo what was done to you or to me or to your father, but I can give you something else if you're willing to accept it. I can give you the tools to build whatever future you want." It would have been easy to be suspicious of her offer, to assume that she was trying to buy my affection or manipulate me for some purpose I couldn't yet understand. But I had spent enough time with her by then to recognize the steel in her character, the same uncompromising strength that I had developed through my years in the Marine Corps. She wasn't offering me charity. She was offering me a partnership, a chance to prove myself worthy of the right name in a way that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with capability. "I'm not interested in handouts," I said. "I've been taking care of myself since I was 20 years old, and I don't plan to stop now." Sarah smiled, and it was the first time I had seen genuine approval in her expression. "I would be disappointed if you were. What I'm offering isn't a gift, Daniel. It's an investment. I've built something significant over the past 40 years, and I need someone to help me take it to the next level. Someone who understands hard work and innovation and isn't afraid to get their hands dirty. From what I've seen, that sounds exactly like you." The deal we struck was straightforward. Sarah would provide the capital I needed to expand my workshop into a full-scale industrial operation, and in return, I would work with her company to develop new technologies for the logistics industry. She would keep 49% of the new venture, I would control 51%, and every decision would require both of our approval. It was a partnership between equals, not a parent rescuing a struggling child, and that distinction mattered more to me than I could easily express. We spent hours in her hospital room hammering out the details, and I found myself impressed by Sarah's business acumen despite her age and her recent injuries. She understood the logistics industry with an intimacy that came from decades of hands-on experience, knew which innovations would actually create value and which were just fancy technology looking for problems to solve. When I described some of the ideas I had been developing in my head during all those night classes at the community college, she didn't dismiss them as impractical or overly ambitious, but instead asked probing questions that forced me to think through the implementation challenges I had been avoiding. Over the following months, I transformed my small Savannah workshop into something that made my previous operation look like a hobby garage. Sarah's capital allowed me to purchase state-of-the-art equipment, hire skilled technicians, and pursue the engineering innovations I had been dreaming about for years. We called the company Right Systems, a name that honored both our shared heritage and the new future we were building together. The transformation was both exhilarating and exhausting. We broke ground on a new facility in March, a purpose-built manufacturing complex that would eventually employ over 200 workers and produce equipment that shipped to ports around the world. I personally oversaw every aspect of the construction, from the foundation pouring to the final electrical connections, refusing to accept anything less than the quality I would have demanded from myself. The contractors learned quickly that I wasn't the kind of owner who signed checks and stayed home, that I would show up unannounced at any hour to check on progress and quality, that my standards were non-negotiable. The work was demanding in a way that I found deeply satisfying. Challenges that required both physical skill and intellectual creativity. Problems that didn't have easy solutions and required me to think in ways I never had before. I designed new hydraulic systems that were more efficient than anything on the market, developed robotic maintenance equipment that could handle jobs previously requiring entire crews of workers, and filed patents for innovations that major logistics companies were already lining up to license. The technical problems kept me up at night, but they were good problems, the kind that rewarded persistence and creativity rather than punishing them. Tommy, my first hire from those early days in Savannah, proved to be an invaluable part of the operation, rising from shop assistant to floor manager to head of our manufacturing division in less than a year. I brought in engineers from universities across the Southeast, offering them competitive salaries and the chance to work on cutting-edge technology rather than incremental improvements to existing systems. The company grew faster than I had any right to expect, and by the end of the first year, we had contracts with 3 of the largest shipping companies on the Eastern Seaboard. Sarah watched my progress with a satisfaction that seemed to go beyond mere business success, and I understood that for her, Right Systems represented something more important than profit margins and market share. It was proof that her son had inherited more than just her blood, that the decades of separation hadn't diminished the potential she had always believed he possessed. While my life was transforming into something I barely recognized from my years with Miranda, hers was undergoing a rather different kind of transformation. The first signs came about 6 months after our divorce was finalized. Whispers that reached me through the professional grapevine about irregularities at the investment firm where she worked. At first, I dismissed the rumors as the typical jealousy that successful people always attract. But the whispers grew louder and more specific, and eventually even I couldn't ignore them. Vince Coldwell, it turned out, was not the sophisticated financial genius he had presented himself as during all those gallery openings and cocktail parties. He was a con artist, a professional predator who had built his entire career on identifying insecure wealthy people and separating them from their money. The revolutionary investment opportunity he had been peddling was nothing more than an elaborate pyramid scheme, a house of cards that was destined to collapse the moment new investors stopped showing up to prop it up. Miranda, blinded by her attraction to Vince and her desperation to climb higher on the social ladder, had made the catastrophic mistake of investing not only her own savings, but also client funds in his fake venture. She had falsified documents, forged signatures, and committed fraud on a scale that would have impressed the most ambitious white-collar criminals. When the scheme finally collapsed, as all such schemes eventually do, she found herself at the center of a disaster that threatened to swallow her entire life. I learned most of this from news reports and the occasional update from mutual acquaintances who seemed to take pleasure in sharing the details of Miranda's downfall. The investment firm had fired her immediately, of course, and the professional licensing boards had revoked her credentials so quickly that she probably got whiplash from the speed of her ejection from the industry. The banks had foreclosed on the Buckhead house, repossessed the Mercedes, and frozen every account she had ever opened. The friends who had surrounded her at that gallery opening a year ago had suddenly become very difficult to reach, their phones going straight to voicemail whenever she called, and their social calendars mysteriously full whenever she tried to schedule lunch. I would like to tell you that I felt nothing when I heard about Miranda's predicament, that I had achieved some kind of Buddhist detachment from the suffering of the woman who had humiliated me so publicly and thoroughly. But the truth is more complicated than that. I did feel something, a complex mixture of vindication and pity, and something that might have been compassion if I had allowed it to develop fully. She had treated me badly, yes, but she was still a human being, still someone who was clearly suffering, and I wasn't sure anymore what kind of man I wanted to be in response to that suffering. The question became more pressing when Miranda appeared at the headquarters of Right Systems on a Tuesday afternoon, about 10 months after the divorce, looking nothing like the polished professional who had held court at gallery openings and corporate events. Her clothes were wrinkled, her makeup was smeared, and there were dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept properly in weeks. The receptionist tried to turn her away, but Miranda made enough noise that security eventually called me to come down and deal with the situation. We sat in my office, a space that was functional rather than fancy, filled with engineering diagrams and prototype components, rather than the art and awards that Miranda would have insisted on displaying. She looked around at the evidence of my success with an expression that seemed to be fighting a war between resentment and calculation, and I waited for her to speak first because I had learned the value of patience in negotiations. "Danny," she said, using the nickname she had always used when she wanted something from me, "I know things ended badly between us, but we were married for 7 years. That has to count for something. I'm in trouble, real trouble, and I don't have anyone else to turn to. Vince disappeared with everything, and now they're saying I'm the one who orchestrated the whole thing. I could go to prison, Danny, actually go to prison." She leaned forward in her chair, and I could see her switching into the seduction mode that had worked so effectively on me during the early years of our relationship. "I'm not asking for money," she said, even though we both knew that was exactly what she was asking for. "I just need help navigating this situation, someone with resources who can connect me with the right lawyers, the right experts. You've always been so good at fixing things, Danny. Fix this for me, and I'll do whatever you want. We can start over. Be the partners we should have been all along." I was foolish to let Vince come between us. I listened to her speech with the detachment of a man watching a television drama, observing the performance without feeling any real connection to the emotions being portrayed. When she finished speaking, she sat back and waited for my response with the confidence of someone who had never been refused anything she truly wanted. "Do you remember what you said to me at the Hartwell Gallery?" I asked, keeping my voice calm and even. "You said that from now on, you would decide when we talk and spend time together. You told me to know my place." Miranda's face flickered with something that might have been shame, quickly suppressed. "I was drunk. I was showing off for my colleagues. I didn't mean any of it." "You meant every word," I said. "You had been meaning it for years. You just finally said it out loud. And that's fine, Miranda. That's actually fine. Because hearing you say it was the best thing that ever happened to me. It showed me exactly what I was dealing with, exactly what our marriage had become, and it gave me the clarity I needed to walk away." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the industrial complex that had grown from my small workshop into something genuinely impressive. "I'm not going to help you," I said, "not because I'm angry and not because I want revenge. I'm not going to help you because you never wanted me to be your partner. You wanted me to be your servant, and that's not a role I'm willing to play anymore." Miranda's facade cracked then, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. "You owe me," she said, her voice rising. "I supported you through all those years when you were just a grease monkey working at the port. I put up with your nightmares and your moods and your inability to fit in with civilized society. You owe me." "I owe you nothing," I said, and I was surprised by how easily the words came. "I worked double shifts to pay for that house you love so much. I sacrificed my own happiness to try to make you happy. I gave you everything I had, and you threw it back in my face in front of 50 strangers. Whatever debt I might have owed you was paid in full that night." I pressed the button on my intercom. "Security, please escort Mrs. Wright out of the building. She's a visitor who has overstayed her welcome." The security guards who appeared in my doorway were professionals who handled the situation with minimal drama, gently but firmly guiding Miranda toward the exit, while she shouted things about lawyers and justice and how I would regret this. I watched her go without feeling anything in particular, just a quiet certainty that I had made the right decision. The legal proceedings that followed were extensively covered by the local media, though I made a point of not following the coverage closely. Vince had been captured trying to cross into Canada with a suitcase full of cash and a collection of fake passports, and he had immediately offered to cooperate with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. His cooperation, predictably enough, consisted mainly of pointing fingers at everyone except himself, and Miranda found herself facing an array of charges that would have been impressive if they weren't so depressing. I attended the sentencing hearing, though I couldn't have explained exactly why. Perhaps it was closure. Perhaps it was curiosity. Or perhaps it was just the human need to witness the conclusion of a story that had dominated so much of my life. The courtroom was sparsely attended, mostly journalists and a few other victims of the scheme who had shown up hoping for some sense of resolution that the legal system rarely actually provides. Miranda's former colleagues were notably absent, having apparently decided that their association with her was something to be forgotten rather than confronted. Miranda looked smaller than I remembered her, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and the handcuffs, and the absence of all the accessories that had once defined her identity. The designer clothes were gone, the perfect makeup was gone, the carefully cultivated aura of success and sophistication was gone. What remained was a woman in her mid-30s who had made choices that had destroyed her life, sitting in a courtroom waiting for a judge to tell her just how destroyed that life would be. Her lawyer made arguments about remorse and circumstances and the influence of Vince Coldwell, painting Miranda as a victim rather than a perpetrator, but the evidence was too clear and too damning for any reasonable person to buy it. The prosecution presented documents that Miranda had signed, emails that Miranda had written, recordings of phone calls where Miranda had discussed how to hide the fraud from regulators. Whatever influence Vince might have had, Miranda had been a willing and enthusiastic participant in the scheme that had stolen millions of dollars from people who had trusted her. The judge was a stern woman who clearly had no patience for white-collar criminals who preyed on people's trust, and the sentence she handed down reflected that impatience. 12 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 8 if Miranda demonstrated exceptional behavior. Miranda's face went pale when she heard the number, and she looked around the courtroom desperately, as if searching for someone who might intervene on her behalf, someone who might stand up and protest that this couldn't be happening, that there had to be some mistake. Her eyes found mine, and for a moment we just looked at each other across the distance that separated defendant from spectator. I remembered the woman I had married 7 years ago, the bright-eyed MBA student who had seemed so impressed by my military service, who had made me feel like I was enough, just as I was. I wondered what had happened to that woman, whether she had ever really existed or whether I had just wanted so badly to be loved that I had imagined qualities that were never there. I wasn't sure what she expected to see in my expression, but whatever it was, she didn't find it. I felt no satisfaction at her downfall, no sense of vindication or triumph. I just felt tired of the drama and the emotions and the weight of our shared history. A television mounted in the corner of the courtroom was playing the local news with the sound muted, and I glanced at it absently while the bailiffs prepared to take Miranda away. The image on the screen made me do a double take. There I was, standing next to Sarah at the grand opening of a new Veterans Support Center that Right Systems had funded in downtown Savannah. The chyron at the bottom of the screen identified us as local business leaders give back to community. And I could see Sarah smiling proudly as she cut a ceremonial ribbon, while I stood beside her in a suit that actually fit properly, looking more comfortable in my own skin than I had ever felt during my entire marriage to Miranda. I hadn't thought of that event as anything special when we had planned it, just a logical extension of my gratitude for the opportunities the Marine Corps had given me and my desire to help other veterans who were struggling to transition to civilian life. But seeing it on that screen at that moment, contrasted against the wreckage of Miranda's choices, something crystallized in my mind about the different paths that people take and the destinations those paths eventually reach. The center would provide housing and job training and mental health support for veterans in the Savannah area, services that I knew from personal experience were desperately needed and chronically underfunded. We had worked with counselors who specialized in PTSD, employment specialists who understood the unique challenges that veterans faced when trying to translate military skills to civilian job requirements, and housing advocates who could help former service members navigate the complex bureaucracy of veterans' benefits. Sarah had insisted that we fund it properly, not as a token gesture for good publicity, but as a genuine commitment to making a difference in people's lives. The building itself was nothing fancy, but it was solid and functional and designed to serve its purpose effectively, much like the engineering principles I applied to everything else in my professional life. I thought about the Marines I had served with, the ones who had come home to find that the skills they had learned in combat didn't translate easily to civilian employment. The ones who had ended up on the streets or in prison or dead by their own hands because nobody had been there to help them make the transition. This center wouldn't save everyone, but it would save some of them. And that was enough to make the investment worthwhile a 100 times over. When the hearing concluded and Miranda was led away to begin her sentence, I left the courthouse and drove to the waterfront, parking my truck near the docks where I had once worked as a simple mechanic and walking out onto a pier that jutted into the Atlantic. The water was calm that afternoon, reflecting the late afternoon sun in shifting patterns of gold and blue, and I stood there for a long time, just watching the light play across the surface. Sarah found me there about an hour later, because of course she did, because she had spent 30 years searching for me and wasn't about to let me out of her sight now that she had finally found me. "The sentencing was today," she said, joining me at the edge of the pier. "It was. Are you all right?" I thought about the question seriously before answering, because Sarah deserved honesty, and I had learned through hard experience that lying about your emotional state only creates bigger problems down the line. "I'm not happy about what happened to her," I said. "I'm not sad about it either. I think I'm just finished. The book is closed, the story's over, and I'm ready to start a new chapter." Sarah nodded, and I could see that she understood what I meant on a level that went beyond mere words. She had spent decades searching for closure of her own, after all, and she knew that some wounds never fully heal, but can eventually stop bleeding if you give them enough time and care. "There's something I've been meaning to give you," she said, reaching into her coat pocket and pulling out a small velvet box. "Your father, your biological father, Richard, he had this made for you when I was pregnant. He was so sure you were going to be a boy, and he wanted you to have something that would connect you to his family's history." Inside the box was a pocket watch, antique and obviously valuable, with the Wright family crest engraved on the case. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of history and expectation, and something that might have been hope for a future that was only now, 38 years later, finally beginning to unfold. "He would have been proud of you," Sarah said. "I know that doesn't mean much coming from someone you just met, but I knew that man for 25 years, and I know what kind of son he wanted. You're exactly what he hoped for, Daniel. Exactly." I slipped the watch into my pocket, feeling the weight of it against my hip like an anchor connecting me to something larger than myself. The sun was beginning to set now, painting the sky in colors that seemed too vivid to be real, and I watched as the light slowly faded and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "I spent so long trying to be what Miranda wanted me to be," I said, the words coming slowly as I worked through thoughts that I hadn't fully articulated even to myself. "I tried to dress the way she wanted, talk the way she wanted, become someone I was never meant to be, and the whole time I was thinking that if I just tried hard enough, if I just made enough changes, eventually she would see me the way I wanted to be seen." Sarah listened without interrupting, a skill I had come to appreciate in our months of getting to know each other. "But that was never going to happen," I continued, "because Miranda wasn't looking at me at all. She was looking at a mirror, seeing only what she wanted to see, projecting her own ambitions and insecurities onto someone who was standing right in front of her, waiting to be noticed. I could have turned myself inside out, and she still wouldn't have seen the real me, because she wasn't interested in the real me. She was interested in the version of me that she had created in her head." I turned to face Sarah directly, and I saw the understanding in her eyes. "But you see me," I said, "from the first day in the hospital, even when you didn't know who I was. You looked at me like I was a person worth knowing, not a project to be improved, not a problem to be solved, but a person with my own value and my own worth." "That's what mothers are supposed to do," Sarah said, "even when they miss the first 37 years. We stood there for a while longer, watching the stars multiply and the moon rise over the ocean that had witnessed so much of Savannah's history. Somewhere in that city behind us, Wright Systems was humming along, producing innovations that would change the logistics industry and providing jobs for hundreds of workers who depended on us for their livelihoods. Somewhere in a federal prison, Miranda was beginning to come to terms with the consequences of choices she had made in pursuit of a success that had never really existed. And somewhere in my chest, in the place where I had once carried the weight of rejection and failure, there was now something lighter, something that felt like it might be peace. I took out the cheap lighter that Miranda had given me years ago, the only gift she had ever chosen herself rather than asking an assistant to select something appropriate. It was a nothing object, really, a gas station impulse purchase that she had wrapped in newspaper and presented on our first Christmas together when we were still too broke for real presents. I had carried it with me for years, not because it was valuable, but because it reminded me of a time when our relationship had seemed full of possibility. I flipped the lighter open, watched the flame dance in the evening breeze, and then closed it again and drew back my arm. The throw was good, a smooth arc that sent the lighter sailing out over the water to land with a distant splash somewhere in the darkness. I didn't see where it landed, but I didn't need to. The point was the letting go, not the destination.